Good evening. Welcome to ArtScapades. Tonight, the Italian Renaissance, from masculine tradition to a woman's perspective. For centuries, women have been excluded from the history of Renaissance art, often only recognized as muses for male creativity. In this lecture, ArtScapades looks at four prominent figures in Renaissance art: two well-known male artists, Raphael and Titian, and two pioneering female artists of the period, Sofonisba Anguissola and Sister Plautilla Nelli. Robin Huffman and Jody Stifelman of Artscapades began teaching art appreciation in 1998. They presented at libraries, art centers, and museums in Connecticut, New York, Massachusetts, and Florida. So please join me in welcoming Robin tonight, who will be presenting the Italian Renaissance.
Thank you, Cindy and Norwalk Public Library for having us back, and welcome everyone. So nice that you came out on this, came out to your computers on this somewhat dark evening now, right? Tonight's lecture, as Cindy said, looks at four artists of the Italian Renaissance, and as the title suggests, we will be talking about two men, Raphael and Titian, and then two women, Sister Plautilla Nelli and Sofonisba Anguissola. And a disclaimer, I do not speak Italian, so pardon any butchering of the language. It'll sound more like French, I'm sure, because I do speak a bit of that. So before we look at the artists, we want to give you a quick review of the artists from the early Renaissance to set the stage for tonight's art. Now, Botticelli was from the early Renaissance. The early Renaissance had been centered in Florence and was largely paid for by the Medici family. And perhaps Botticelli's best known work, The Birth of Venus, or as we sometimes call it and others call it, Venus on the Half Shell, was commissioned by the Medici family. In the High Renaissance, then, Da Vinci and Michelangelo were the heavy hitters. The High Renaissance was centered in Rome as opposed to Florence and was mostly paid for by the popes, and supposedly it almost bankrupted the city. The High Renaissance roughly spans the 4 decades from 1490 to the sack of Rome in 1527, and it represents the accepted high point of Renaissance art, the period when the ideals of classical humanism were fully implemented in both painting and sculpture, and when the techniques of linear perspective, shading, and other methods of realism were mastered. So tonight we do continue in the Renaissance and we remain in Italy. Our first artist will be the last major artist of the High Renaissance, Raphael, who again was working in Rome. And our second artist is part of another movement that was being developed in Venice. The Venetian Renaissance was led by the Bellini family, specifically Giovanni Bellini, who was said to have revolutionized Venetian painting. And what he was doing was moving it towards a more sensuous and coloristic style. Through the use of clear, slow-drying oil paints, Bellini created deep, rich tints and very detailed shadings. Bellini's treatment of light is particularly beautiful in this work. His sumptuous coloring and atmospheric landscapes had a great effect on the Venetian painting school, especially on his pupils Giorgione and Titian, and we will be discussing Titian as tonight's second artist. We will finish tonight's lecture moving from the masculine tradition to the feminine perspective of the Renaissance with our last two artists. So with this background in mind, let's look at our first one. Raffaello Sanzio, better known as Raphael. Along with Da Vinci and Michelangelo, Raphael was one of the masters of the High Renaissance and is best known for his depictions of the Madonna. So the next time you see a Raphael, it will probably be of a Madonna. I know when I go to museums, I'm always saying, oh, yep, that's a Raphael, because it's another Madonna. Raphael was born on April 6, 1483 in Urbino and received his earliest lessons in art from his father Giovanni, who was court painter to the Duke of Urbino. And Urbino is northeast of Florence, about 3 hours away in modern day travel time. So obviously a lot further in travel time back then. So when Raphael was 8, his mother passed away, and his father sadly died 3 years later. Raphael was apprenticed to Pietro Perugino in nearby Perugia, capital of the Umbrian region of Italy, and he spent his teenage years as an apprentice there. Typical of the time, Raphael imitated his master closely, And as you can see, their painting styles are so similar that art historians have found it difficult to determine which were painted by Raphael and which were by Perugino. Throughout his career, Raphael continued to be influenced by the artists of the time, learning and furthering his talent by incorporating what he saw around him. Now, by the age of 17, Raphael had completed his artistic training and was pronounced a master and began to secure his own commissions. Raphael's first documented work was for the bronze altarpiece made for a chapel in the church of San Agostino near Urbino. And Raphael and an older painter from the workshop of Raphael's father received the commission to paint the work jointly. Now, despite the fact that he was only 17, Raphael actually was the one that was referred to as the master in the contract. During an earthquake in 1789, the altarpiece was seriously damaged. It was decided to saw it into pieces and only display the undamaged parts. The fragments were acquired by Pope Pius VI for the Vatican, where they remained until 1849. And it's unclear what happened to them after that. Only many years later were scholars able to trace back 6 different pieces, 4 fragments of the main painting and 2 fragments from the altar itself. And here are the 4 fragments of the main painting, which, as you can see, are in different collections. The painting showed Nicholas of Tolentino standing in an archway with the devil at his feet. And next to him were 3 angels. Above him, God was placed with a crown in his hand and surrounded by the heads of angels. Now, the Umbrian cities and courts provided a source of wealthy clients for Raphael, and he could have had a lucrative career by just staying there. But Raphael's desire to learn more led him to Florence in 1504, where Michelangelo and Da Vinci both worked at that time. Raphael painted this altarpiece for the small Franciscan convent of Sant'Antonio in Perugia, and it hung in a part of the church reserved for the nuns, who are thought to have insisted on some of its conservative features, such as the elaborately clothed Christ child. By contrast, the weighty male saints reflect the progressive style developed by Leonardo da Vinci and Fra Bartolomeo that Raphael had just begun to study in Florence. The lunette above the main panel depicts God the Father holding a globe and delivering a blessing between 2 angels and 2 seraphim. Sitting in the center of this work in a bright red dress is the Madonna. She is fair-skinned with blonde hair, and there appears to be a sheer, translucent ribbon elegantly flowing across the top of her dress and behind her head. The faintest golden halo surrounds her. In her left hand, she holds the baby Jesus, who embraces her, and he looks back over his shoulder with a slight smile. With its softness of contour and perfection of balance, this work has been noted for its resemblance to some of Da Vinci's paintings of the same subject. Madonna of the Chair was created more than a decade later, but also reflects the sweetness and harmony that we have come to identify with Raphael. It is considered by many to be the most popular of all the Raphael Madonnas and was painted for a member of the Medici family. Of particular interest is its circular design. All of the interlocking arms and legs and the directional gazes within the painting serve to emphasize the circular composition. And as we said when we introduced Raphael, he is best known for his many images of Madonna. Some of his most popular ones have been made into postage stamps for a multitude of nations. Now, an interesting irony for these scenes of quiet faith is the notion, recorded by the art historian Vasari, that Raphael was an atheist and that he painted what would be acceptable, not what he felt to be true. Raphael appreciated feminine beauty and was noted to have been a ladies' man. In 1508, Raphael was called to Rome by Pope Julius II and commissioned to paint frescoes in what was intended to become the Pope's private library at the Vatican. Several other artists were already at work on different rooms, including Michelangelo, who was working on the Sistine Chapel ceiling at that time. And the most famous of the works that Raphael did at the Vatican is the School of Athens, which represents the concept of philosophy. The painting displays the greatest thinkers of the Greek world, most notably Plato and Aristotle. All of the architectural lines lead back to a vanishing point right behind them, and the arched doorway further serves to emphasize their importance. And while Raphael portrayed famous thinkers from 1,000 years before his time, he used portraits of his contemporaries in the composition. In the place of Plato, for instance, supposedly it's Da Vinci. Likewise, Michelangelo is depicted as Heraclitus, so sorry about that. And Raphael portrayed himself in a less significant area. He peers out at the viewer from the center of a group of scholars at the far right edge of the composition. Now, a well-known story suggests that Raphael snuck into the Sistine Chapel while the painting of its ceiling was in progress and added Michelangelo to this painting after he found himself influenced by the energy and action of Michelangelo's compositions. Michelangelo accused Raphael of plagiarism and years after Raphael's death complained in a letter that, quote, everything he knew about art he got from me. So now, in addition to asking Raphael to paint frescoes in the Vatican, Pope Julius II commissioned Raphael to paint his portrait. With this work, Raphael is credited with revolutionizing portrait painting. The presentation of the subject was unusual for its time. Previous papal portraits showed them from the front or kneeling in profile. The intimacy of this image was unprecedented. Raphael shows the sitter so clearly in a particular mood, and here the Pope is lost in thought. We see the Pope clutching a silk handkerchief, indicating his inner sensitivity. Raphael's portraits were able to show the emotions that lay beneath the surface, but also respect the image that the sitter wanted shown of himself. Now, Pope Julius was depressed because the city of Bologna had seceded from the Papal States. He expressed his grief at this political disaster by growing a beard, imitating what Renaissance humanists had discovered was an ancient form of mourning. It is the beard that enables this portrait to be dated. And with this portrait, Raphael had created a model, virtually a formula followed by most future painters. Now, Raphael was kept busy in Rome doing commissioned portraits of two popes, leading citizens, and wealthy art patrons. And here he has painted Bindo Altaviti, a rich banker, who was also a cultured man who loved the arts. At this time, Raphael was experimenting with different styles. The graceful, almost effeminate position of the subject, along with the heavy contrast between light and shadow, are atypical of Raphael's work, particularly of his portraits of men. Now, for years, this painting was thought to be a self-portrait of Raphael as a young man. While that was not the case, there is a kinship that comes across clearly in the painting. In a sense, every portrait also reveals something about the painter. Raphael was in the middle of this commission in a room intended to be used by Pope Julius II as a private audience chamber when the Pope died. Pope Julius II had wanted the frescoes to illustrate the power of the Church and its representatives. The general theme was of God's intervention in human destiny. Pope Leo X, whose given name was Giovanni de' Medici, obviously a member of the Medici family, saw to the completion of the last scenes. The meeting of Leo the Great and Attila is one of the frescoes in the series. The painting shows the meeting between Pope Leo I and Attila the Hun and includes the images of St. Peter and St. Paul in the sky bearing swords. Now, initially, Raphael depicted Pope Leo I with the face of Pope Julius II. But after Julius's death, Raphael changed the painting to resemble the new Pope Leo X. Have to do what your boss, put your boss in there. So Raphael's rise continued under the patronage of the new Pope. Very successful, Raphael had a workshop of about 50 pupils and assistants, said to be the largest workshop team assembled under any single old master. Many of these assistants and pupils later became significant artists in their own right. In 1515, Pope Leo X commissioned Raphael to design cartoons for a series of tapestries for the Sistine Chapel. Tapestry cartoons are the life-size models from which tapestries are woven, and the tapestries were to hang below the early frescoes on the chapel walls. An elite workshop in Brussels was chosen for the difficult task of interpreting Raphael's cartoons and converting his ideas into tapestries. Now, Raphael knew that comparisons with his designs and Michelangelo's ceiling were inevitable, so he took great care when painting the cartoons himself and actually produced a depth of color that was not possible to reproduce in a tapestry at that time. The 10 tapestries were woven between 1516 and 1521, and 7 of the completed works were hung in the Sistine Chapel for the first time on St. Stephen's Day, the 26th of December, 1519. This is possibly the only time that Raphael saw any of the finished tapestries in their intended location, as he died less than 6 months later. The Raphael tapestries and the cartoons that form the initial designs from which they were made are among the greatest treasures of the Renaissance. Now, Raphael was as handsome and charming as he was talented, and he became so popular that he acquired the nickname the Prince of Painters. He lived in a grand style in a palace. He was made a groom of the chamber of the Pope, which gave him status at court and an additional income, and he was also made a Knight of the Papal Order of the Golden Spur. In 1514, Raphael became engaged to Maria Bibbiena, the niece of Cardinal Medici Bibbiena, most likely at the request of the cardinal, rather than any real enthusiasm on the part of Raphael. The 6-year engagement officially ended with her death in 1520, just months before Raphael's own death. Now, the real reason Raphael may never have married Maria was his mistress, Margherita Luti, who was with him throughout his life in the papal court. She was the daughter of a baker and therefore not considered to be of Raphael's social level. She is the subject of this painting and appears in this subsequent, more sensuous portrait. Pinned to her turban in both paintings is a pearl, and Margherita means pearl in Latin. Clues to their relationship can be found in the recently restored La Fornarina. Half clothed and smiling suggestively, she wears a ribbon on her arm bearing Raphael's name. X-rays taken during restoration revealed that on her left hand was a ruby ring, which had been painted out probably by Raphael's students after his death. It's possible that Raphael may have been secretly married to Margherita. To anyone who understood the symbolism of the Renaissance, the portrait practically shouted, "This is my beautiful wife, Margherita, and I love her." Now, the art historian Giorgio Vasari stated that Raphael's death was due to an exhausting night with Margherita. How Vasari would have known this is unclear. According to Vasari, Raphael supposedly fell into a fever, and not telling his doctors what the cause was given the wrong cure, which led to his death. But whatever the cause, and it could have been lead poisoning from his painting materials, his acute illness lasted 15 days. Raphael was composed enough to receive last rites and to put his affairs in order. He dictated his will, in which he left sufficient funds for his mistress's care, but 4 months after his death, she had taken refuge in a convent. This is Raphael's last painting and was left unfinished. In the upper part of this work, Christ, following his transfiguration, floats in front of softly illuminated clouds. And in the lower part, Jesus and his apostles had tried unsuccessfully to free a possessed boy of his demons. The recently transfigured Christ arrives and performs a miracle. Vasari described this work as the most famous, the most beautiful, and most divine. Raphael died on Good Friday, the 6th of April, 1520, precisely 30 years after he was born. His funeral mass was celebrated in a grand manner at the Vatican, and this unfinished painting was placed at the head of the bier, and Raphael's body was buried in the Pantheon. Raphael had planned that he would be interred in the Pantheon so that the final rays of daylight from the 27-foot diameter oculus fall on his tomb, and he is buried in the Pantheon beside his fiancée Maria, which served to preserve Raphael's reputation and distance him from his mistress. Raphael was young, rich, outgoing, and movie star handsome, as well as being enormously talented. The inscription on his marble sarcophagus reads, Here lies that famous Raphael by whom nature feared to be conquered while he lived, and when he was dying, feared herself to die. And we know our second artist, Tiziano Vecchiello, better as Titian. His talent as a painter was recognized early in his own lifetime, and his reputation has never suffered a decline. Titian was born in the small alpine village of Pieve di Cadore, north of Venice, near the Austrian border, to parents of modest means. As for the date of his birth, no one really knows. It was undocumented at the time. By his own account, Titian was born in 1477, but many modern scholars think he was actually 10 years younger. It's generally believed that Titian exaggerated his age to elicit sympathy and to create an image of an aged, tireless genius. Titian's greatness as an artist was not matched by his character, for he was notoriously greedy. In spite of his wealth and status, he claimed he was impoverished. And Titian is considered by many to be the greatest Italian Renaissance painter of the Venetian school that we mentioned earlier. Now, in 1498, Titian and his brother Francesco were sent to Venice to start training as painters in the workshop of Sebastiano Zuccato, who specialized in mosaics. And while his brother stayed there to study, Titian left and apprenticed first for Gentile and Giovanni Bellini, then under Giorgione, where he was his personal assistant until Giorgione's death in 1510. Dating from that time, this is among the earliest of Titian's devotional paintings of the Madonna and Child. The boldness of color, the pyramidal arrangement centered on the Madonna's broad lap, and the trees rising up from behind are all characteristics of his work at the time. An examination with infrared reflectography reveals that initially Titian conceived a more conventional picture. Titian planned the Madonna and Child sitting in an upright posture with the baby's chubby body seen clearly at right. He then shifted the child to the left into a reclining position with the Virgin bent over him in a tender gesture. In 1510, Titian received his first important commission to paint frescoes of 3 of the miracles of St. Anthony for the house where the Brotherhood of St. Anthony met. The Healing of the Wrathful Son depicts St. Anthony as he reattached the foot of a young man who would cut it off in an outburst of violent temper because he had hurt his mother with it. The Miracle of the Jealous Husband portrays a man stabbing his wife after she has been unjustly accused of adultery. And when the man discovers the truth, he begs for pardon to St. Anthony, who resuscitates the woman. And this scene is portrayed in a smaller size on the right. Titian's third fresco, found on an adjacent wall that we don't see here, depicts the miracle of the newborn child. St. Anthony worked a miracle in which an infant spoke in defense of his mother, who had been accused of adultery. The very individual faces show Titian's mastery of his craft, even at this early stage in his career. 3 years later, with business doing well, Titian opened his own workshop and was able to hire 2 assistants. He was commissioned to paint this work for the high altar of the Franciscan church in Venice. The strong, simple colors used here and the silhouetting of dark forms against a light background are typical of Titian's work of this period. But the soaring movement of the twisted Virgin rising from the group of dramatically gesturing apostles towards the hovering figure of God caused a sensation. It disturbed people, but made Titian the most celebrated painter in Venice. One of Titian's most famous paintings, this is one of 5 mythological works commissioned by the Duke of Ferrara, and the works all celebrate the god of wine, Bacchus, and are called bacchanals. This painting illustrates the story of Princess Ariadne, who, in love with the hero Theseus, helped him to kill the Minotaur. Theseus then abandoned her while she slept. Distraught, Ariadne was wandering along the shore, searching for sight of Theseus' ship, when she was surprised by Bacchus. Now, Bacchus had fallen in love with her and asked her to marry him, offering her the sky as a wedding gift, in which one day he promises she would become a constellation. Now, Bacchus is recognizable both by the laurel and grape leaves adorning his hair and by his noisy group of followers. One of these crashes cymbals while in a pose mirroring Ariadne's, and she has been startled by Bacchus. Titian shows the ship on the horizon, reminding us that Ariadne has been abandoned by Theseus, and also shows Ariadne's potential future through the promised crown of stars above her head. Now, the composition can be divided diagonally into two triangles, one of a still blue sky broken only by the actions of the two lovers. The other, a triangle full of movement with colors that are predominantly brown and green. And Titian has used the color blue to move our eyes from the sky to the cymbal crasher's skirt to Ariadne herself. In the early 1520s, Titian became involved with a young woman named Cecilia, a barber's daughter from his hometown. Originally his housekeeper, Cecilia became his mistress, and they had two sons. In 1525, Cecilia fell seriously ill, and Titian, wishing to legitimize their sons, married her. Cecilia recovered, and the marriage was a happy one. But sadly, Cecilia later died, giving birth to their daughter. Heartbroken, Titian moved to a new home and had his sister come to take charge of the household and care for the children. Now, needing and wanting to get back to painting, Titian threw himself completely in a new creative direction. His style became more restrained and less adventurous. He used related colors rather than the contrasting colors for which he was known, and the presentation of the Virgin is an example of this meditative style. In it, Titian portrays a young Mary who is dedicating her life to God, leaving her home and entering the temple where she will pray and study for 10 years. The little girl's solitary walk up the massive staircase is memorable, as well as being one of the few heroic images of a young female in all of Western painting. Titian used compositional schemes which, compared with some of his earlier works, appear almost archaic, and Titian has lit the steps to provide diagonally upward movement. But most of the other elements of the painting are either horizontal or vertical. The painting has lots of contrast in light and shadow, but seems almost static. And Titian painted this way until he met Michelangelo in 1545, who critically said to him, quote, that he was not paying enough attention to the detail in his painting. It appears that this advice is what Titian needed because almost overnight his painting style returned back to the way it had been before his wife passed away. Titian's meeting with the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V in Bologna in 1530 would be another determining event in his life. This work was painted during Titian's second meeting with the emperor, and it is a variation on an original painting that had just been completed by the German artist Jakob Seisinger. Titian surpassed the earlier work, managing to give the emperor a new aristocratic bearing, emphasizing him as more slender. Pleased with the portrait, in 1533, Titian was appointed court painter and awarded the title Count Palatine and Knight of the Golden Spur. Titian became a shrewd businessman who invested his earnings, and by the time he was 45, he was already wealthy and famous. So famous that there is a tale that one day when the emperor was visiting his studio, Titian dropped his brush and the emperor stooped to pick it up. Now, Titian made a lot of money from his portrait commissions. He had an ability to please his sitters while still retaining his artistic integrity and providing insight into the individual. He established models for aristocratic portraiture which remained influential for centuries. And this portrait by Titian is at the Frick, and hopefully you'll get a chance to see it there if you haven't already. And at the same time, you can see the newly renovated Frick. The subject of this portrait, Pietro Aretino, was a poet and author known for his attacks on the powerful. He grew wealthy on gifts from kings and nobles who feared his satire, and he coveted the fame that came with it. Among Aretino's friends and patrons were some of the most prominent figures of his time, several of whom gave him gold chains, such as the one he wears in this portrait. Now, Aretino was on intimate terms with Titian, who painted at least 3 portraits of him. Here, Titian conveys his friend's intellectual power through his forceful gaze and his worldliness through the solid, weighty mass of his robes and the chain. This work, completed for the Duke of Urbino, is especially interesting for its many hidden meanings. The painting represents the allegory of marriage and had to serve as a teaching tool for the young wife of the Duke. First, the evident eroticism of the painting had to remind the woman of the marital obligations she would have to fulfill for her husband. The dog, by her feet, symbolizes fidelity, and the housemaid behind, looking at the girl while she rummages in a chest of drawers, symbolizes motherhood. The figure's pose is based on Giorgione's Sleeping Venus, which interestingly Titian had completed for him. But Giorgione's is not suggesting erotic things like Titian's is. In his depiction, Titian has domesticated Venus by moving her to an indoor setting, engaging her with the viewer, and making her sensuality explicit. Venus displays none of the attributes of the goddess that she's supposed to represent. She stares straight at the viewer, unconcerned with her nudity. In her right hand, she holds a posy of roses, and with her left, covers herself with some modesty. Here, Venus is at once idealized and unapologetically erotic. The light and warm color of her body is in contrast to the dark background and brings out her eroticism even more. And the strong sensuality of this painting was therefore consistent with its private domestic purpose. In his 1880 travelogue, A Tramp Abroad, Mark Twain called the Venus of Urbino the foulest, the vilest, the obscenest picture the world possesses. And this painting would inspire so much art in the future. Ang thought this work was one of the best ever created and painted Grand Odalisque. And Odalisque is a Turkish concubine, so both paintings have the same erotic tone, just different settings. And Edouard Manet loved it so much, he used the same idea in Olympia, only the woman was a prostitute in his piece, and she had a cat next to her, a symbol of prostitution in the 19th century. Titian painted the Pietà when Venice was struck by plague, and it turned out to be his last work. It was made as an offering, a prayer for the survival of himself and his beloved son, Orazio. In the bottom right hand, propped under a stone lion, is a tablet on which Titian and Orazio are depicted praying to the Virgin for delivery from the plague. An inscription in the lower part of the painting notes that it was finished after his death by Pommel the Younger, who added the torch-bearing cherub. Along the diagonal format formed by the figures, we are witness to an outpouring of human passion. Mary Magdalene turns in a cry of uncontrollable grief. The Virgin appears frozen in contemplation of her dead son, and St. Jerome leans forward to catch the last breath of Christ. Sadly, Titian's prayer did not work. Titian died from the plague on August 27th, 1576. He was about 90 years old, but we can't be sure. He was buried at the Church of Maria Gloriosa dei Frari, and he was the only victim of that plague outbreak to be given a church burial. His son Orazio, who was his assistant, died shortly after him from the plague as well, leaving Titian's home and his studio containing many unfinished paintings, and it was all looted. Titian's influence on later artists has been profound. Art critics throughout history generally credit Titian for being one of the first artists, if not the very first, to make the brushstroke into a fully expressive and significant element of the painting. So we're going to turn now and look at our two women artists of the Italian Renaissance. In Renaissance Italy, most women from the upper classes had only two options in life. You had marriage or you had the convent. The Renaissance was an incredibly difficult time for women to become artists. Women were unable to obtain formal art training, so they were either self-taught or they were taught by their fathers or husbands. Even if they managed to establish a career, women artists were widely overlooked, as it was thought that the painter's brush was more manly. However, despite all challenges, some women managed to become acclaimed artists, even leading ones. Lavinia Fontana is regarded as the first female career artist in Western Europe, as she relied on commissions for her income. Her family relied on her career as a painter, and her husband served as her agent and raised their 11 children. Fontana was the daughter of the painter Prospero Fontana, who was a prominent painter at the time and served as her teacher, and she spent her career in Bologna and Rome. Plautilla Nelli is recognized as the first woman who was a painter in Florence during the Italian Renaissance. Though it has not been possible to confirm that this is a portrait of Nelli, it is the only image that has even been suggested to be of her. Polissena Margherita Nelli was born in 1524 into a wealthy Florentine merchant family allied with the Medici. At the age of 14, Nelli became a nun, entering the Dominican convent of Santa Caterina da Siena, located in Piazza San Marco, where she adopted the name Plautilla. And over the years, she was named a prioress of the convent 3 times. In the Renaissance, cloistered convents were home to many educated and talented women who enjoyed freedoms denied their married counterparts in the outside world. And one of these freedoms was to pursue an artistic career, considered inappropriate and impossible for most women during that time. The convent of Santa Caterina was managed by the Dominican friars of San Marco and led by Savonarola. And Savonarola was known for his prophecies of civic glory, the destruction of secular art and culture, and his calls for Christian renewal. Savonarola's preachings promoted devotional painting and drawing by religious women in order to avoid sloth or laziness. So the convent became a center for nun artists. Nelly's sister Costanza also entered a convent as Sister Petronia, and Nelly's sister wrote a biography about Savonarola, while Nelly devoted her time to developing her art, characterized by religious themes, and Nelly became known for her ability to portray emotion in the faces of the people she painted. Nelly broke the mold in more ways than one. As a self-taught artist, she set up a successful workshop where she instructed other sisters in the art of painting, using preparatory drawings from her own extensive collection. And she also helped to support the convent with the sale of her workshop's devotional works of art. St. Catherine receiving the stigmata and St. Dominic receives the rosary were both rescued from storage and restored in 2009. And they and a few other paintings by Nelly can now be viewed in the San Salvi Museum, a former monastery on the outskirts of Florence. Nelly is the only female artist to be referenced in the historian Vasari's famous Lives of the Most Excellent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects. However, in the book, Vasari criticized Nelly, explaining that her best works were copies and that her limitations were due to her lack of formal training, especially in the case of portraying men, as her religious vocation prohibited the study of the male nude. Nelly's male figures are said to have feminine characteristics. Nelly's works were of high quality, and she enjoyed the favor of many patrons, many of them women, for whom she painted altarpieces, devotional images, and miniatures. Nelly's works were not only very popular, but were also considered very precious. People who owned a painting by a nun assigned an almost magical power to the work. Unfortunately, most of these individual small works have been lost. The Uffizi, which has begun a long-term project for promoting women artists, held an exhibition of Nelly's work in 2017. And the rediscovery of Nelly and the first restoration of her works are due to the AWA, the Advancing Women Artists Foundation, a U.S. organization, and in particular its founder, Jane Fortune. Now, initially, only 3 works had been attributed to Nelly. Now, 16 additional works by Nelly have been uncovered, which makes a total of 19 and counting. Influenced by the teachings of Savonarola, Nelly's paintings reveal her own religious fervor in their intense emotion. They show her appreciation of Renaissance art, particularly that of the Florentine monk, Father Bartolomeo. According to Vasari, Father Bartolomeo left his drawings to his pupil, Father Paolino, who upon his death left them with the nun that painted. Didn't even use her name. So Nelly undertook the almost 10-foot-high altarpiece of the Lamentation with saints for the Dominican convent of St. Catherine of Siena, now the San Marco Museum. It is her most famous public work. Her use of Father Bartolomeo's drawings as models for her work is clear. In Nelly's Lamentation, she seems to have freely adapted the Father's composition to include 2 additional women next to the Virgin Mary. These figures and the men standing behind them openly express their grief through their gestures and visible tears. At Christ's feet is Mary Magdalene. Nellie thought big, and as we can see, did not limit herself to small and pretty images as most of her contemporaries would have been forced to restrict themselves to. Now, Nellie's Last Supper is a first in the history of art by women. No woman artist ever painted this subject before she did. By creating and signing this enormous fresco-like work depicting one of Florence's most loved subjects, Nellie successfully placed herself among the ranks of her male counterparts. This is also considered Nellie's most significant work because of its size. It's nearly 23 feet long. One of the most frequent questions people ask when talking about Nellie's Last Supper is if, besides the fact that Nellie signed it, is if art experts can tell it was created by a woman. Now, that's a tricky question, but one historian says his focus goes straight to the table. According to gender expectations in the Renaissance period, women were, quote, best at rendering details like lacework or precious objects. Nellie's Last Supper is far more elaborate than that of her male counterparts in Florence, who created the 7 well-known Florentine Last Suppers, and it's thought that Nellie would probably have seen 4 of them. In contrast to the men's Last Suppers, the food in Nellie's painting is placed on a long table covered with a crisp, freshly ironed tablecloth. We are looking at a peasant-style meal that would have been similar to those served at Nellie's convent. In addition, she included fine Chinese porcelain bowls and platters, and porcelain from the Far East was an extremely rare commodity. Nellie may have seen it growing up or may have seen it at the convent, which was full of Florentine noblewomen who typically brought personal belongings with them to the convent. Nellie's Last Supper remained unseen in her convent's dining hall until 1808, when all convents were closed under Napoleon's rule. Rolled up and put into storage until 1853, which caused damage and paint loss. It was moved to the friar's private dining hall in the Dominican Church of Santa Maria Novella. Restoration, sponsored again by the AWA, was completed in 2018, and after being hidden from the public eye for over 450 years, Nellie's Last Supper now hangs in the Santa Maria Novella Museum Refectory in Florence. Nellie died on May 7th, 1588, and was probably buried inside her convent in a general tomb with the other prioresses, but neither the convent nor the church connected to it exists today. In 1853, the convent was supposedly annexed into the Galleria dell'Accademia and was briefly part of the Accademia delle Belle Arti. It's believed that many more works by Nellie are awaiting rediscovery, especially as Vasari said she painted prolifically for the houses of gentlemen in Florence, as well as for the convent where she lived and painted for over 50 years. So why had Florence, so known for its Renaissance art, overlooked Nellie, as had most of the art world? Was it because she was trained in a convent and not apprenticed in an artist studio? Or was it simply because she was a woman and beyond that a nun? Well, today she is no longer overlooked. Now, if you're interested in learning more, the book Invisible Women, Forgotten Artists of Florence by Dr. Jane Fortune describes the history of female artists in Florence, and there are hundreds of works in the city's museums or storehouses. The book contains 26 chapters on 35 women artists, including Nellie, who were active in Florence. Or if you prefer a video, in 2013, an Emmy-winning PBS television documentary was made based on Dr. Fortune's book and features a segment on Nellie and the restoration of 2 of her works that we've just looked at. The video is available for viewing on the PBS website and on YouTube. Now, our last artist is best known for her portraiture. Sofonisba Anguissola was one of the first women artists to establish an international reputation. And while she was the best known female painter of the Italian Renaissance, she is relatively unknown in today's art history. I'll bet you knew Raphael and Titian before you knew her name. So Anguissola was born in Cremona in northern Italy in about 1532 into a family of ancient nobility, but with limited economic resources. She was the first of 7 children, 6 of whom were girls. Anguissola's father was a vestryman, and one of his duties was to find the artists for the decoration of the cathedral and other churches of the city. When he saw that his eldest two daughters had an aptitude for painting, he sent 14-year-old Anguissola and her sister Elena to study art with Bernardino Campi, a respected religious painter and portraitist in Cremona. Anguissola's father saw learning to paint as part of the new humanist education for a woman of high social standing. Anguissola never sold a single painting. Her earliest works were self-portraits that testify to her modesty. Anguissola identifies herself in a number of paintings as a virgin, as female virtue was founded in chastity, and female virtue was also understood to include obedience, modesty, and silence. Anguissola's demeanor and simple dress, usually a black jacket with a white lace collar, conform to these aspects of virtue. Instead of continuing her art studies, Anguissola's sister Elena chose to enter a convent in Mantua. To commemorate Elena's taking of her vows, Anguissola painted this image, which is thought to be Anguissola's earliest known original work. Wearing a white habit, Elena holds a book of prayers, which is covered in burnt sienna-colored leather and decorated in gold. This book is the only source of detail in a painting where light is one of the main themes. What is most striking about this portrait is the depth and intensity of Elena's gaze, which is directed at the viewer. Anguissola has captured her sister with exceptional honesty and insight, drawing us into the mental and emotional space of the painting. Among Anguissola's earliest paintings were self-portraits that attest to her competency in letters, music, and painting, and as already mentioned, testified to her modesty. And in this work, Anguissola shows herself holding a small book which bears the inscription, Sophonisba Anguissola, a virgin, made this herself in 1554. The small size of the book suggests a devotional book or a book of love sonnets, and either would have been appropriate reading material for a woman of Anguissola's station. Before she was 20, Anguissola created this work, one of her most famous paintings. This portrayal of an everyday, informal domestic scene was a first in Italian painting, and with it, Anguissola is credited with inventing genre painting 100 years before painting genre scenes came into vogue. This painting shows three of Anguissola's sisters, Lucia, Europa, and Minerva, playing chess with their governess looking over them. The fact that the girls are engaged in a friendly game of chess is something that is extraordinary in and of itself. During the Renaissance, chess was thought to be a game of intelligence and was therefore commonly reserved for the gentlemen of the day. Women were usually painted performing domestic pursuits. Now, chess had undergone many rule changes since it was introduced in Italy in 1510, and the new game of chess being played in Anguissola's time was played much like it is played today. The sister to the left looks out at the viewer after winning the game, and Anguissola shows her proficiency as a painter by positioning the figures in different poses. Their gazes lead our eye around the canvas and eventually back to Anguissola herself, who occupies a position outside the canvas. Anguissola shows further skill by painting a variety of textures in her sister's clothes and that of the imported carpet under the chessboard. Anguissola's style drew notice and brought her commissions throughout Italy. Sometime around 1554, Anguissola left for Rome, where she met Michelangelo, who showed her great kindness and encouraged her in drawing and design. And while Michelangelo was known to have a kind personality, he would not have spent time with Anguissola, especially during his old age, if she hadn't been gifted. It was during this time that Anguissola's drawings changed from the elongated forms of her teacher Campi to the well-rounded, anatomically correct forms taught by Michelangelo. Anguissola supposedly made this drawing as a study piece in response to Michelangelo's suggestion that drawing a crying child would be difficult. And we are looking at one of Anguissola's younger sisters as she calms their only brother who has been bitten by a crawfish. Now, Michelangelo kept the drawing. It is thought to have been seen by Caravaggio and to be his inspiration for this work. Anguissola painted this remarkable double portrait in which she shows herself being painted by Campi. Anguissola has made herself central, higher and larger than her teacher, who was somewhat marginalized to the side of the picture plane. Now, there are a few reasons why Anguissola may have painted the portrait this way. This work was painted a full 10 years after Anguissola's apprenticeship with Campi had ended, and he had long since moved away from Cremona. He went on to paint portraits for moderately distinguished North Italian princesses, while she went on to work at the court of the most powerful monarch in Europe. Anguissola's contemporaries may have seen two reasons to praise this double portrait. First, Anguissola introduced a new compositional device, a teacher painting a student who was painted by the student. This demonstrated her gift for invention. Second, it was probably seen as a female artist's acknowledgement of her master being the one who created her, a way to pay homage to Campi for helping her to develop her own widely acknowledged talent. But it is thought that there is more to why she painted herself larger than Campi. The fact is that Anguissola's worth as a painter, when calculated by the prestige of her patrons, became greater than that of her mentor, a man, not to mention a man of lesser social rank. Now, Anguissola painted more self-portraits than almost any artist of her time, in part because she was considered so amazing that people wanted paintings done both by her and of her. And to move away from the formal static style of the day, Anguissola liked to highlight her subjects' hobbies, even her own, and here she's playing the spinet, which is a type of harpsichord. In addition, Anguissola painted miniatures. This miniature shows Anguissola's meticulous technique and a Renaissance taste for puzzles. The interwoven letters at the center of the medallion form a complex monogram that spells out her father's name, Amilcare, and around the rim, the medallion is inscribed in Latin, and I'm translating. The maiden Sophonis by Anguissola, depicted by her own hand from a mirror at Cremona. Anguissola's reputation spread beyond Italy, and in 1559 she was invited to Madrid to the court of Philip II, where in addition to painting portraits, she was an attendant to the Infanta Isabella Clara Eugenia and a lady-in-waiting to her mother, Philip's third wife, Elizabeth of Valois, with whom she developed a friendship. Instead of being compensated monetarily as male court painters were, female artists often received luxurious gifts for which no records were kept. As such, there are fewer historical clues and much controversy in attributing paintings to Anguissola. An example of that is this portrait of Philip II, which was originally attributed to a male fellow court painter, but it was ultimately attributed to Anguissola in 1996. In it, she shows a somber Philip II fingering his Order of the Golden Fleece and dressed in the high hat and black clothing that typified his midlife. Anguissola's residency at the Spanish court lasted more than a decade, and during that time she was asked to paint portraits of the royal family and its court. Now, the subject of this portrait was a sister of Philip II. She married Prince Juan of Portugal, but just 2 years after their marriage, Juan died and Juana returned to Spain. Although she was celebrated for her ability in state affairs, Juana later devoted her energies to religious life. In 1557, she founded a monastery which became an important center of artistic patronage, and this portrait was painted in 1561 for the Pope and was meant to show Juana's religious devotion. The child by her side is probably a young aristocrat under her protection who is being prepared to enter the religious order. Now, an interesting note is that Isabella Stewart Gardner bought this painting believing it to be by Titian, even though she had been warned that the attribution was in question. It was later reattributed to Anguissola and is one of just a few works by Anguissola in an American museum. Now, back in the court of Philip II in 1568, Elizabeth died in childbirth, and Anguissola found herself in an unusual position for her time. She was in her mid-30s, and she was unmarried. Out of respect for Anguissola's friendship with his wife, Philip II arranged for Anguissola to marry a Sicilian nobleman, Fabrizio Moncada Pignatelli. Now, Anguissola received a royal pension of 100 ducats that enabled her to continue working and tutoring would-be painters. Her private fortune also went to supporting her family back in Italy. After 8 years with the Spanish court, Anguissola and her husband, with the king's permission, left Spain, and the couple settled in Palermo, where Fabrizio died in 1579. Unfortunately, the majority of Anguissola's paintings from this period burned in a fire in the Prado during the 17th century. After losing her husband, Anguissola had been invited back to the court of Philip II. Now, in her late 40s and wanting to see her home and family back in Italy, Anguissola traveled to Genoa by sea and met and fell in love with the ship's captain, Orazio Lomellini, and it is believed that Anguissola proposed and they married quickly against the wishes of her family, as her brother, now head of the family, considered Lomellini below his sister's station. The marriage, however, was a good one. They lived in Genoa, where Anguissola established a painting school. And in this portrait, Anguissola addresses aristocratic culture, believed to have been painted soon after her arrival in Genoa. This work shows Giuliano moving from childhood to adulthood, and childhood is represented by the younger boyish page. The now more adult Giuliano is shown on the pedestal where he is posing for Anguissola. And by 1620, with her eyesight failing, thought to be from cataracts, Anguissola had returned to Palermo. Anguissola continued painting portraits throughout her life. This one shows her almost 80 years old, seated on a chair, holding a book and a piece of paper. Interesting to notice that she is dressed not altogether different from the outfit in her 1556 painting, black, modest, and reserved. In 1624, the year before she died, Anguissola was paid a visit by the Flemish painter Anthony van Dyck, a young man at the time who made sketches and painted a portrait of her. Van Dyck wrote about Anguissola that, quote, "It was a great pleasure for her to have pictures placed in front of her. When I drew her portrait, she gave me several hints, not to get too high or too low, so the shadows to her wrinkles would not show too much." Now, Anguissola never had any children, but appears to have been very close with her nieces and her stepson. In addition, she was an influential mentor to many aspiring artists, right up until her death in 1625 at the age of 93. She was outlived by her second husband, who had her tomb inscribed, so to Sophonisba, my wife, who is recorded among the illustrious women of the world, outstanding in portraying the images of man. Anguissola was among the most accomplished painters of the late Renaissance. Vasari, who saw her work in her father's house in 1566, noted in his book that she had, quote, "worked with deeper study and greater grace than any woman of our times at problems of design, for not only has she learned to draw, paint, and copy from nature, and reproduce most skillfully works by other artists, but she has on her own painted some most rare and beautiful paintings." Now today, Anguissola's paintings can be found in museums around the world. So, thank you for joining us. If you would like a list of where some of the works mentioned in this lecture can be found within driving distance, please email us at info@artscapades.com and include which lecture you're asking for. And this one, you can just call it masculine and feminine. We'll be back on Wednesday, November 19th with Futurism from Static to Dynamic, which finishes up our three-part series on Italian art at Norwalk. And dates for all of our lectures can be found on our website. If anyone has any questions or comments, I'd be happy to take them. I'll stop sharing my screen now. If anyone have any questions or anything in the chat? Let's see what's in the chat. This lecture is recorded, yes. Someone asked if it was recorded, and it is. So
Yes, it
you want
should be
the-
up,
yeah.
probably by the end of the week.
I'm sorry, I've kept having to drink my water. I think the air is getting dry. So anything that you can, any paintings that appealed to you, Cindy?
Oh, I just like it. They all were great. I really enjoyed it. And, you know, I'm so impressed with especially the two women. I mean, they're amazing.
Very
Amazing.
interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's really against all odds because they did not have the backing of anyone else. Although, you know, their husbands and the fellow nuns and everything were quite supportive of them, which was nice. But you really had to find people that were in your corner
Yeah.
because society was not, though. Yeah. Anyone else have any questions? No. If not, I hope to see you back for Futurism. Thank you so much for coming.